My parents said I ruined their lives the moment I was born. They didn't whisper it in a fight or let it slip in anger. It was their mantra, repeated so often that it hung in the air of our house like wallpaper. I grew up with it pressed into my skin, a quiet accusation that I carried everywhere I went. If I broke a plate, it wasn't just a mistake. It was proof that I was their burden. If I needed new shoes, it wasn't just childhood. It was theft from their happiness. By the time I was 10, I knew the shape of their disappointment better than I knew the sound of my own laughter. And yet, when you hear something every day, you start to believe it, even when some tiny part of you wonders if maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't you at all. I learned early to make myself small, to avoid taking up space, to never ask for more than scraps. But here's the part they never saw coming. One day, I stopped believing them. One day, I realized that the cruelest thing they ever taught me, that I didn't deserve love or a life of my own, was the biggest lie of all. And that was the day I began planning my escape. I remember the exact night it finally sank in that I couldn't stay there anymore. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the sting of their words echoing in my head. My father had looked me straight in the eye that evening and said, "If you hadn't been born, we'd be living in a better house, driving better cars. You stole everything from us." My mother didn't even flinch. She just nodded like it was a fact of life, like the weather or the time of day. I sat there, my hands trembling on the table, staring at the chipped rim of my glass and thinking how strange it was that a child could be blamed for choices she never made. I felt something in me split open that night, a sharp crack between who they said I was and who I knew I could become. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to their muffled snores through the walls, and I whispered to myself, "This isn't my life. Not anymore." It wasn't courage yet, but it was the seed of it, and once planted, it refused to die. The day I truly began to separate myself from them didn't look different from any other on the surface, but inside me, everything had shifted. I woke up to the sound of my father coughing in the kitchen, the clatter of a spoon against his mug of bitter instant coffee, and my mother's voice already sharp, already wound tight with irritation. They weren't even arguing with each other, not really. They were circling me, circling the idea of me, like vultures around something they wished had never existed. "If she hadn't been born," my mother muttered, not even bothering to lower her voice, "we could have retired by now. We could have traveled. We could have had a real life." My father gave that low grunt of agreement, the sound I'd grown up with, as steady as any heartbeat. I sat on the edge of my bed, the springs groaning under my weight, and realized I wasn't even angry anymore. Anger had burned out years ago, leaving only a heavy kind of clarity. If I stayed, my whole life would shrink into these four walls, into their bitterness and endless blame. They weren't going to stop reminding me that I was unwanted, and if I kept breathing in the same air as them, one day I would start to believe it again. So I started taking mental notes, small ones at first. I noticed how much cash my father kept in the old ceramic jar above the fridge. I noticed my mother's habit of forgetting to lock the front door at night when she went to water her plants on the porch. I noticed the shift manager at the diner where I worked double shifts, how he glanced at me with pity when I slipped a free meal into a paper bag because he knew I had nowhere else to eat. That pity didn't sting anymore. It fueled me. Every detail I collected became part of an invisible map leading me somewhere else, anywhere else but here. At night, lying awake, I imagined the taste of freedom like a secret I was almost afraid to say aloud. What would it feel like to walk into a place where no one knew my name, where no one had decided I was a mistake before I even opened my mouth? The plan wasn't cinematic. I didn't have a suitcase by the door or a one-way bus ticket tucked into my pocket. It was quieter, more desperate than that. I started tucking away tip money in the lining of my old school backpack, folding the bills until they were soft with handling. I told my parents I was working extra shifts because we needed the money, and they believed me because of course they did. they'd trained me to shoulder responsibility that was never mine. They didn't question the hours or the exhaustion on my face. Why would they? To them, my suffering was a given, just another proof that I owed them everything. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. Every greasy dollar that passed from a customer's hand to mine was one step closer to the life they swore I didn't deserve. And here's the part that still makes my chest ache when I think about it. They didn't even notice me pulling away. My mother was too busy cataloging the ways her life had been ruined. My father too lost in his bitterness to see me rehearsing my departure in every careful movement. I'd sit at the dinner table, pushing beans around my plate, and in my head I was already gone. I was already imagining the sound of a bus engine rumbling beneath me, the blur of highways outside a smudged window, the relief of putting miles between their words and my heart. I was already choosing a name for the person I was going to become when no one was there to tell me I was worthless. By the time I finally slipped out, it wasn't a dramatic escape. It was a quiet step into the night, the weight of my backpack digging into my shoulders, the silence of their house heavy behind me. I didn't slam a door or leave a note. I didn't give them one last chance to spit venom my way. They didn't deserve the courtesy of knowing where I was going or what I was going to build. I walked down the street, past the same cracked sidewalks I'd memorized all my life, past the flickering street lamp that had always hummed like an omen, and I didn't look back. Every step forward was proof that I could live without their permission, that I could breathe without their approval, that I could exist without apology, and for the first time in my life, I believed it. I found a room above a laundromat that smelled like warm fabric and lemon detergent, and I signed the lease with hands that shook not from fear, but from the sheer, ridiculous fact that I was paying for a place of my own for the first time. The landlord, a woman named Rosa who wore her silver hair in a tight bun and charged me a cautionary smile, accepted cash and didn't ask for references because she could see I'd learned to keep my head down. My first week alone, I slept with the window open even in the cold, because I wanted to hear the city breathe and remind me I wasn't trapped inside their house any longer. And the light through the thin curtains felt like proof that the world kept turning whether or not my parents had chosen to love me. I started working 2 jobs. Daytime at the diner where I'd already earned the manager's pity into a steadier hourly wage, and evenings sweeping floors at a small floral shop that closed at 9. I learned the names of flowers as if they were a new alphabet. Peonies for warmth, eucalyptus for breath, iris for hope. Arranging bouquets became an act of patience and tenderness I granted myself, a ritual that stitched my nerves back into something resembling calm. Money came in slow, furious drips. I kept a small notebook and wrote down every bill, every coin I hid in the lining of my backpack, and the total kept climbing in a handwriting that grew steadier with each entry. I bought a cheap phone off a Craigslist ad and memorized a new number that didn't ring with their names. And when my mother called on a Saturday afternoon to complain about the neighbor's dog, or how the soap she bought didn't lather like it used to, I let it go to voicemail and listened to the hollow ache in her voice from the sidewalk outside my door, while steam from the laundromat rose into the sky. Sometimes I answered and the conversation was sharp and small. "You left like a thief," my father would say. And I would say, "I left to live." And we both hung up before either of us could soften, because neither of us knew how. The first time I sat down to eat alone without glancing over my shoulder for their disapproval, I cried into my soup until I could taste only broth and salt. And then I wiped my face and put on lipstick as if to armor myself for the world. Insurance on the bus, a library card, an appointment to open a savings account. These small acts felt like assembling a life with spare parts until it started to look whole. At the bank, the woman behind the counter asked why I wanted to open a joint account, and I said, "I don't," with a voice that surprised even me. And she smiled like she'd been waiting for that answer her whole shift. I put my name on the lease, on the bank paperwork, on the mail slot by the door, and that little card with my name printed by a machine made my chest loosen in a way I hadn't expected. I started to wear clothes that fit my body differently, not to show off, but to feel the fabric as a second skin instead of a uniform for humility. I learned the bus routes and the people who took them. The woman with the knitting needles that clicked like a metronome, the teenage boy who always read in the same corner with headphones in. These ordinary lives became my new neighborhood, a gentle reference book of other people's days that I could open without apology. Work brought more than money. The florist's owner, a quiet woman named June, started giving me extra hours and taught me how to propagate a cutting from a plant with my own hands, explaining it like a secret. You give a little and something comes back. She didn't ask where I came from or why I stayed late. She simply nodded when I told her I wanted to learn and left me to the green light of the shop where the plants thrived under my care. I swallowed the numbness that used to be my daily companion and, instead, practiced saying small truths aloud. I deserve this apartment. I deserve 3 squares a day. I deserve compliments without flinching. Saying them felt foolish at first, like telling a joke and waiting for no one to laugh, but the words gathered weight and finally landed somewhere inside me that remembered how to breathe. The quiet victories piled up. My first paycheck that paid the electricity bill and left a little in savings. The landlord's nod when I replaced a broken bulb. The day I walked past a mirror and didn't flinch at my reflection, but instead straightened my shoulders and thought simply, I am here. Of course it wasn't all grace. There were shifts when a customer shouted for coffee and spilled his rage on my apron. Nights when I cried until sleep pulled me under because the loneliness pressed so close it felt like a physical thing. Moments when the bills stacked like accusing letters on the kitchen counter, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake leaving the only life I knew. And there were calls. Endless. Sometimes begging, sometimes accusing. Always trained on the wound they had helped make. That made me want to crawl back through the small keyhole of my old room and disappear into their version of safety. Each time they called to tell me I'd ruined them, to announce some catastrophe for which I was somehow responsible, I kept a small list in my head of the exact dates they had said those words. The phrasing, the time on the microwave clock, until the list became evidence I could produce to myself when doubt crept in. It mattered to hold the proof. Text messages where my mother wrote, "You chose to leave us at 2:14 a.m. My father's voicemail saying, "We could have been happy if not for you," timestamped. A bank transfer I declined because I recognized their guilt as currency and refused to be bought back into submission. With evidence in hand, my resolve hardened into strategy. I enrolled in night classes at the community college for bookkeeping because I liked numbers. They were honest, thematically small and exquisite, and I imagined one day balancing my own ledger so cleanly that my past would be nothing but a footnote. Books became my allies. I learned how to file a complaint, how to set boundaries, how to say no without apology. The first time I said no to my mother when she demanded money, she claimed she needed for rent, but I suspected would disappear into a habit of blaming me later. I felt like I'd broken a law I didn't know I'd agreed to. She cried and called me selfish, and I sat on my threadbare couch and let the phone ring out because the alternative, surrendering myself again, felt like slow death. The city taught me other things too. How to find free medical clinics, how to stretch $1 into 3 meals, how to keep receipts and why it mattered. It taught me that survival required cleverness and a willingness to ask for help when pride wanted to be louder. Slowly, the life I built began to reflect not who I had been under their roof, but who I might become on my own terms. And with each small success, the idea of revenge shifted from a hot, dangerous wish into something colder and more precise. Not punishment, but separation, not humiliation, but independence. I started to think of revenge as the careful closing of accounts, the refusal to be the perpetual debtor of anyone else's unhappiness. And there, in the quiet geometry of my new life, I found a modest, stubborn joy that felt like reclaiming my own name. The first real test of the new life I was building came one gray afternoon when my parents showed up at the diner where I worked. I saw them through the smeared glass door before they saw me, their familiar silhouettes framed by the neon open sign, and for a second it felt like being yanked back into childhood. The weight on my chest, the instinct to shrink small enough not to be noticed. But then I caught my reflection in the steel of the coffee pot I was holding, apron tied around my waist, hair pulled back neatly, face tired but steady. I wasn't the child they had left behind. I wasn't the mistake they had named me. I was the woman who had built a life out of tips and flowers and late-night bus rides. When they slid into a booth, I walked over, not because I wanted to, but because I refused to hide in the kitchen like a scared teenager. My father ordered a black coffee like always. My mother tapped her nails against the table, eyes scanning the room as if to judge the company I kept. "We need to talk," she said, and I almost laughed because in our language that had never meant talking. It meant demanding, accusing, rewriting history until I was the villain again. They wanted money, of course. A loan, they called it, but I knew better. My father leaned across the table and said the line I had heard my whole life. "You owe us. We gave you everything and you gave us nothing." The words should have gutted me. Instead, they rang hollow, like a recording I'd already memorized. I set down the coffee pot, pulled out my little notebook, the one where I kept receipts and hours and lists of things that proved I was surviving on my own. I flipped to a page and let them see the neat columns of numbers. Rent paid, bills covered, groceries bought, savings growing. I didn't need to say a word. The evidence spoke louder than their accusations. My mother's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but the sight of those numbers silenced her in a way my voice never could. My father muttered that I was ungrateful, that without them I'd have nothing, and I told him, calm and low, "Without you, I finally have something." They left before finishing their coffee. My hands were shaking when I cleared the cups, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was adrenaline, the realization that I could stand up in their presence and not collapse under their weight. That night, I walked home past glowing windows and thought about how strange it was that people saw parents as a guarantee of love when mine had been nothing but creditors demanding payment for my existence. I replayed the look on my mother's face when she saw my ledger, how it cracked her certainty, and I understood then that the best revenge wasn't screaming or fighting. It was showing them, with undeniable proof, that I didn't need them, that their power over me had expired. After that, the calls grew more desperate. My father's voice turned sharp, my mother's turned wheedling, switching between curses and pleas in the same breath. "Family is all you have," she'd say, as if she hadn't spent my whole life reminding me I was never really part of hers. I let the calls go to voicemail. I saved them, each one a piece of evidence, each one a reminder. I didn't block them because I wanted to remember, not out of masochism, but out of resolve. Their voices became a kind of background noise, like traffic outside the window, no longer dictating the pace of my heart. In the silence between their words, I began to dream of something bigger than survival, of finishing school, of opening my own shop one day, of putting my name on a sign that no one could take credit for but me. It was around then that June, the florist, handed me a set of keys and said she was going to visit her sister out of state for a few weeks. "I trust you to run the shop," she told me, simple as that, as if trust was the most natural currency in the world. I stood there holding those keys, heavier than gold, and realized that someone saw me as capable, responsible, trustworthy. Everything my parents had sworn I wasn't. I watered the plants at night, swept the floors, arranged bouquets with steady hands, and every customer who left smiling felt like a vote of confidence in the life I was building. One evening, after closing, I sat among the flowers with the shop bathed in green shadows, and I whispered to myself the truth I had waited years to believe. I am not their mistake. I am my own creation. The weeks running the flower shop changed me more than any class or paycheck ever had. There was something about locking up at night, keys jingling in my hand, that made me feel like I was finally holding the steering wheel of my own life. Customers began asking for me by name. A young man came in every Friday to buy a single rose for his girlfriend, and he'd joke with me about how she pretended not to care, but secretly waited for it all week. An older woman asked me to arrange flowers for her husband's grave, and when I placed the bouquet in her hands, she squeezed mine like she was passing on some unspoken strength. Every small interaction wove me deeper into a world where I wasn't a burden, but a participant, a presence that mattered. My parents didn't stop circling, though. They started leaving messages that twisted between guilt and rage. "You'll come crawling back when the world eats you alive," my father hissed in one voicemail. In another, my mother cried, "Do you really think strangers will care about you more than your own blood?" But their voices no longer echoed as they once had. I'd listen, then tuck the phone away and return to trimming stems or counting the cash drawer. The truth was simple. Strangers had shown me more kindness in a year than my parents had in my entire life. June's trust, Rosa's leniency with rent when I was short 1 month, the regulars at the diner who left me notes on napkins, all of it added up to a kind of chosen family, a quiet safety net my parents had insisted didn't exist. I saw them again once, not by choice. I was leaving the bank one afternoon, my hands full of deposit slips and my chest light with the knowledge that I had nearly $1,000 in savings now. Real money. Money that meant possibility. My mother was standing on the sidewalk as if she had materialized from a shadow, her coat buttoned wrong, her eyes glassy. "You think you're better than us now?" she snapped before I could even speak. My father hovered a few steps behind, his jaw tight, his fists buried in his pockets. For a moment, fear tried to creep back in, that old instinct to apologize just for existing, but I straightened, clutching my deposit slip like a shield, and said, "I don't think I'm better. I just know I'm free." The words hung between us, heavier than any scream. My mother's face crumpled, not from hurt but from fury, and she spat that I would regret walking away. I didn't. I walked past her, past both of them, and the sunlight on my face felt like a benediction. At night, in my little room above the laundromat, I began to write down not just receipts and bills, but dreams. Lists of places I wanted to visit, books I wanted to read, skills I wanted to learn. It was like rebuilding myself brick by brick with paper and ink as mortar. I enrolled in more classes, stayed late at the shop, and saved until the envelope under my mattress grew thick. Sometimes, when the loneliness felt unbearable, I would sit on the floor and open that envelope, fanning the bills like proof that I wasn't just surviving. I was building. Every dollar was distance from the voices that once told me I'd ruined their lives. Every dollar was a stake in the future they swore I'd never have, and maybe that was the cruelest truth of all. They had wanted me to fail, to prove them right. But every choice I made, every shift worked, every flower arranged was a quiet rebellion against the prophecy they had written for me. My revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was steady. It was patient. It was the refusal to collapse. By the time I turned 25, I had built a rhythm that felt almost like a second skin. Mornings at the diner, afternoons in class, evenings in the shop, and late nights at my small desk under the flickering lamp where I worked through numbers that no longer confused me, but instead whispered the language of order and control. I had enough saved to move into a bigger apartment, but I stayed in the room above the laundromat because it felt like sacred ground, the first place that was ever mine. Some nights, lying in bed with the hum of machines below, I would think about how far I had come from the girl who whispered escape plans into the darkness of her parents' house. I was no longer whispering. I was living them out loud. But progress always has shadows, and mine came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, thin and creased, my name scrawled in my mother's slanted hand. I nearly tossed it in the trash unopened, but something in me wanted to see the script they were trying to write this time. Inside was not an apology, not an acknowledgement, but a demand disguised as desperation. "We're losing the house. We need your help. You owe us at least that." The word "owe" leapt off the page like a brand, the same weapon they had always used. I held that letter under the lamp, hands steady, and realized that this was the final test. If I sent money, I would be stepping back into the role they had chosen for me, the scapegoat, the debt that could never be repaid. If I refused, I would be drawing a line so sharp it might cut what little thread still connected us. I folded the letter neatly, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and filed it in the folder I had begun keeping labeled evidence. Not evidence for a court, though maybe one day it could be, but evidence for myself. Every voicemail, every text, every letter that proved who they were and who I had become despite them. When my phone rang that night and my father's voice thundered down the line, accusing me of heartlessness, I didn't tremble. I said calm and clear, "I don't owe you my life." "I'm done paying for existing," he shouted. My mother wept in the background, but I hung up, turned off the phone, and went back to my homework. That night I slept deeper than I had in years. The next morning, I woke with an idea sharp as glass. I would take everything they had used against me, their words, their accusations, their attempts to bind me in guilt, and I would make it fuel. I doubled down on my classes, finished my bookkeeping certificate, and June offered me a stake in the flower shop when she decided to retire. Signing those papers, my name inked next to hers, felt like erasing every time my parents had said I was nothing. I wasn't just someone's mistake anymore. I was an owner, a businesswoman, a builder of something alive and thriving. I heard later through a cousin that my parents did lose the house. They moved into a smaller place, bitter and angry, blaming me to anyone who would listen. But when I thought of them, I didn't feel triumph or pity. I felt distance, the clean kind, the kind that doesn't ache. I knew then that my revenge was complete, not because they had suffered, but because I no longer did. Their words couldn't reach me here, in the shop full of green and bloom, in the apartment where sunlight spilled across a table I had bought with my own money. I was free, and freedom was louder than any accusation they could hurl. Owning part of the flower shop changed everything, not just in the practical sense of income, but in how I saw myself. I remember standing in front of the store on the morning we replaced the old weathered sign. The new one was simple, elegant, carved in dark wood with gold lettering, and beneath June's name was mine. I stood there with the sun in my eyes, apron tied around my waist, and felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Customers walked in and out all day, some congratulating me, others not even noticing. And that was the beauty of it. My name was fixed in place, undeniable, a part of the city's rhythm. My parents had sworn I would never amount to anything, that I would be nothing more than the shadow of their bitterness. But here I was, standing in a doorway that belonged to me, breathing air that was entirely my own. They tried one last time to break through. My mother showed up at the shop on a rainy Thursday, dripping wet, her mascara streaked. She asked me for money again, said they had no groceries, said I was heartless to turn away from the people who gave me life. I stood behind the counter, my hand steady on the glass case of lilies, and told her that giving birth wasn't the same as giving love. Her mouth opened and closed like she was swallowing water. "You ruined our lives," she said again, the same tired refrain, and I realized it no longer pierced. It slid off me like water over stone. Customers were watching, the bell above the door jingling as someone else entered, and I made a choice. "You don't get to speak to me like this in my store," I said, voice even. "If you want flowers, I'll sell them to you. If you want guilt, I don't carry that anymore." She flushed, sputtered, and left without buying anything. The door shut behind her, and I felt something inside me settle for good. That night, I walked home through streets slick with rain, neon lights reflected in the puddles, and I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who sat on the edge of her bed counting coins, the one who thought survival was the best she could hope for. She was still inside me, but she wasn't steering anymore. I was steering. I was choosing, and I was free. The next morning, I found myself smiling as I arranged roses in the window, the kind of easy, unthinking smile that had been foreign to me for years. It wasn't just about proving my parents wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was right to leave, right to believe I deserved more, right to build a life worth living. When I think of revenge now, I don't picture screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. I picture the quiet power of saying no, the strength of walking away, the peace of locking my own door at night, safe in a space that is mine. My parents may still tell anyone who will listen that I ruined their lives. Let them. I rebuilt my own, and that's a story louder than theirs will ever be. The day I knew I had finally closed the book on them came unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary morning at the shop. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9, came in clutching a few wrinkled dollar bills. She wanted a single flower for her teacher. I knelt down, showed her a yellow daisy, and told her it was perfect. She beamed as if I'd given her the world. When she left, skipping down the sidewalk, I stood there holding the empty vase and felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from a fierce, overwhelming recognition. I had spent my entire childhood being told I was nothing more than a weight on someone's shoulders, and here was this girl, light and unburdened, free to give a flower as a gift instead of a plea for worthiness. In that moment, I saw what I had broken away from, and what I had built instead. A place where people walked in and left carrying something beautiful, where their joy wasn't conditional or rationed. I heard, through the same cousin who occasionally updated me, that my parents had grown more bitter with time. They blamed me for every misfortune, spun tales about how I had abandoned them cruelly, how I had stolen what was rightfully theirs. Maybe people believed them, maybe they didn't. It didn't matter anymore, because their version of the story no longer defined mine. What mattered was that when I woke in the mornings, I woke to the scent of fresh flowers, the hum of traffic outside, the steady rhythm of a life I had created with my own hands. My apartment was still small, the ceiling still low, but it was filled with books, plants, and photographs, not of the past, but of friends, of customers who had become family, of little victories captured in color. The evidence folder still sat in my drawer, thick with years of accusations, demands, and lies. Sometimes I'd take it out and flip through, not to hurt myself, but to remind myself of the distance traveled. Each voicemail transcribed, each letter preserved, was a stepping stone away from their grip. I didn't need to show it to anyone else. It was enough that I knew the truth, and that the truth had freed me. That evening, I closed the shop, turned off the lights, and stood for a long moment at the doorway, watching the street glow with the soft orange of sunset. I thought about the night I had first walked away from their house, a backpack digging into my shoulders, fear like a knife in my ribs. I thought about how quiet it had been, how final. Now, years later, standing at the threshold of a life that was mine, I felt the same quiet. But this time it wasn't fear. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've written your own ending to a story someone else tried to control. And maybe that's the truest revenge of all. Not just leaving the people who tried to break you, but building something so solid, so unshakable, that their voices can't touch it anymore. I wasn't their burden, their mistake, or their ruin. I was living proof that even the most poisoned soil can grow something beautiful if you refuse to believe the lie that you were never meant to bloom. Life began to stretch wider than survival, and I started letting myself imagine futures that once felt impossible. I signed up for night courses in accounting, and sitting in those classrooms with a notebook open in front of me, I realized how much I loved numbers, not just for their clarity, but because they were incorruptible. My parents had twisted words my whole life, but numbers never lied. Balancing ledgers, calculating interest, tracking expenses, it was like building walls around myself out of stone, each equation another layer of protection. With every exam I passed, I could see a version of myself standing taller, steadier. I thought about how my father always said, "You'll never make it without us," and I smiled when I aced a test he wouldn't even understand. The shop flourished under my care. We started offering small workshops, how to arrange bouquets, how to care for houseplants, and people came. The little shop that once barely made rent was now alive with laughter, chatter, and the rustle of leaves in vases. June would stop by sometimes and watch me, shaking her head with quiet pride. "You've made this yours," she said one evening, and the weight of those words nearly made my knees buckle. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, with recognition, not resentment. Customers began trusting me with their milestones, weddings, funerals, anniversaries. I wasn't just selling flowers. I was becoming part of their stories, and in turn they became part of mine. My parents, of course, didn't vanish. They lingered like ghosts, reaching through phone calls, through letters, through cousins who would mention them at gatherings. They wanted me back in their orbit, not out of love, but because they needed someone to hold accountable for their unhappiness. The difference now was that their attempts didn't ignite panic anymore. They only reminded me why I had left. I no longer debated with myself whether I was cruel for not answering. I wasn't cruel. I was protecting what I had built. I was protecting myself one night after closing. I sat at the shop's back table surrounded by stems and petals, my hands stained green, and I thought about the word ruin. They had said I ruined their lives simply by being born. But here I was, surrounded by beauty, by growth, by life I had nurtured. Maybe they had been right in one way. I did ruin something. I ruined their ability to keep me small. I ruined the cycle of blame they had tried to pass down like an heirloom. I ruined their script, the one where I was meant to stay broken forever. And in its place, I had written something new. I didn't need their apology anymore, though sometimes I imagined what it would feel like. Not because I believed it would come, but because I liked knowing I didn't require it. My life was no longer waiting for their permission to begin. It was already in motion, already thriving. The shop, the classes, the friends who invited me out for coffee, the neighbors who waved when I passed by. All of it was mine, untouched by their bitterness. And yet deep down, I carried one truth like a flame I refused to let go out. I hadn't just escaped. I had rebuilt. And the woman I was becoming was stronger, sharper, and freer than they ever wanted me to be. The shift from surviving to truly living came with something I hadn't expected: love. Not the desperate kind I had once chased, trying to patch the holes my parents left in me, but something gentler, steadier. His name was Daniel, a customer who first came into the shop to buy flowers for his sister's graduation. He had a quiet smile, the kind that made you feel seen without a single word. At first I thought nothing of it, brushing it off as another transaction. But he kept returning, sometimes for lilies, sometimes for nothing at all, just to talk. He asked questions no one else had ever asked me: what I liked to read, where I wanted to travel, what I dreamed of building beyond these four walls. At first I stumbled over the answers because I wasn't used to anyone caring. But slowly I found myself opening. One night after closing, he walked me home through the soft glow of street lamps. We passed the laundromat, the flicker of neon, the smell of detergent heavy in the air. I admitted to him that this little room above the machines was the first place that had ever felt like home. He didn't laugh or pity me. He simply nodded and said, "Sometimes the smallest places hold the biggest freedom." It struck me then. He wasn't trying to rescue me, and he wasn't trying to rewrite my story. He was simply willing to walk beside me in it, but with love came fear. My parents' voices still echoed in my head. "You're unlovable, you're broken, you'll ruin anyone who gets close to you." The first time Daniel reached for my hand, I froze, expecting him to recoil when he realized how scarred my insides were. But he didn't pull away, he held on. And I realized that maybe the only way to silence their voices forever was to let myself believe in a world beyond their lies. Of course, word of my new life trickled back to them, as it always did. A cousin mentioned Daniel at a family gathering, and soon after my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "So you've found someone to clean up your messes now?" "He'll leave once he knows the real you." I stared at the screen, waiting for the shame to wash over me like it used to. But nothing came. I deleted the message without replying. For the first time, their words didn't feel like shackles. They felt like static. Background noise. Daniel never asked about them, never pushed. But one evening when we sat in the shop surrounded by leftover roses, I told him everything. The accusations, the guilt, the night I left with only a backpack. I expected him to flinch, to pity, to question. Instead, he said, "You're stronger than anyone I know. And the fact that you built this life out of their ruins? That's not just survival. That's victory." His words sank into me like sunlight into soil, warming something that had been frozen for too long. I still had nightmares sometimes, of their house, of their voices, of being dragged back into the role they had written for me. But when I woke up, sweaty and shaken, I reached for the evidence folder and reminded myself of the facts. I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't theirs anymore. I was here in a life I had created, with people who saw me for more than what I had been told I was, and maybe that was the most dangerous revenge of all. Not just surviving, not just thriving, but daring to love in spite of the people who swore I would never deserve it. The call that nearly cracked my resolve came late one night while I was balancing receipts at the shop. The phone lit up with my father's name, a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Against my better judgment, I answered, maybe out of habit, maybe out of some small, foolish hope that things had changed. His voice was slurred with drink, heavy with venom. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think a little flower shop makes you better than us. But you'll always be ours. You'll always carry the stain of what you did to us just by being born." I sat there in the darkened shop, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, my hands tightening on the phone. The old fear tried to claw its way back, the one that used to keep me awake at night. But then I looked around me, at the shelves of vases, the neat stack of ledgers, the keys in my pocket that opened a door with my name on it, and I realized the only thing that still bound me to them was this phone line. So I ended it. I hung up mid-sentence, blocked the number, and placed the phone face down. For a long time I just sat there, breathing, until the silence grew warm and steady. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was final. The fallout came quickly. They sent letters, then more letters, then messages through relatives, all dripping with the same poison. Some accused me of cruelty, others begged for money, others threatened to expose me as ungrateful. I didn't reply to a single one. Instead, I slipped them all into the evidence folder, the file that had grown so thick it barely closed. Each page was proof not of their control, but of my refusal to bend to it. When I flipped through those pages late at night, I no longer saw a child drowning under their words. I saw a woman who had built a case for her own freedom, one entry at a time. The shop continued to thrive. I expanded the hours, hired a part-time assistant, and for the first time I could afford not just rent and bills, but small luxuries, a new coat, dinners out with Daniel, a weekend trip to a neighboring town where we wandered through markets and laughed like teenagers. I felt myself loosening piece by piece, as if every layer of fear was peeling away to reveal someone I had always been, but never had the chance to show. Yet at the edges of my joy, there was still that whisper. They'll find a way to drag you back. Trauma doesn't disappear just because you've left the house where it grew. It lingers, testing your strength. The true test came when I received a notice from a lawyer. Not mine, theirs. My parents were trying to sue me for abandonment, claiming I owed them financial support because they had raised me. The absurdity nearly made me laugh, but when I read the legal jargon, my stomach dropped. They were trying to use the system, to twist even the law into another chain. I brought the papers to June, hands trembling, and she told me firmly, "Get a lawyer. You don't face this alone." For the first time in my life, I didn't. Daniel helped me research, and we found a woman named Marisol who specialized in cases of parental abuse. She read the evidence folder front to back, her brow tightening with each page, and finally said, "They don't have a leg to stand on. What you have here isn't just proof you don't owe them. It's proof of years of manipulation. The case never even made it to court." Once Marisol filed the response with attached evidence, their lawyer backed off quietly, almost embarrassed. I imagined my parents seething in their cramped new house, realizing their words had finally lost their power, not just over me, but over anyone else who saw them. And that was when it struck me. I hadn't just escaped their narrative. I had dismantled it. They could still scream into the void, but no one was listening anymore. That night, I stood in the shop long after closing, the air thick with the scent of roses and eucalyptus, and I whispered aloud the words I had once only dared think in secret. "I am not yours." I never was. The silence answered me like an embrace. For the first time, I felt not just free, but untouchable. The morning after the lawsuit dissolved, I woke up before sunrise and sat by the window of my small apartment with a cup of coffee warming my hands. Outside, the city was just beginning to stir. Buses groaning awake, shopkeepers rattling shutters, a pale strip of gold climbing the sky. It was the same city I had fled to years before, terrified and carrying nothing but a backpack and a plan stitched together from desperation. But the girl who had arrived then was gone. In her place sat a woman who owned her own business, who could pay her bills, who could love without apology, and who no longer bowed to voices that had tried to convince her she was a mistake. I thought of my parents and, for the first time, felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not grief. Just absence. The cord that had tied me to them was cut clean. Their voices, their accusations, their endless chorus of blame were no longer my soundtrack. In the quiet of that morning, I realized the truest revenge had already happened, not through shouting or dramatic showdowns, but in my refusal to play the part they had written for me. I had taken the role of the unwanted child and turned it into the story of a woman who walked away, built her own foundation, and never looked back. Later that day, I opened the flower shop and arranged a bouquet of daisies and roses in the front window. A little boy passing with his mother pointed and grinned, tugging at her sleeve until she came inside. I wrapped the flowers for them, tied the ribbon tight, and watched as they walked away hand in hand. That moment, as small as it was, felt like the culmination of everything. I had taken the word ruin, the curse my parents had thrown at me since birth, and transformed it into bloom after bloom, color after color, life after life. I will never get an apology, and that's all right. I no longer need one. The life I've built is louder than any sorry they could ever say. And if they still tell the world I ruined their lives by being born, let them. I know the truth. I didn't ruin their lives. I saved mine. So now I leave you with this. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed, carrying the weight of their bitterness forever? Or would you have walked away and risked everything for freedom? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the hardest revenge isn't fire or fury. It's choosing to live well and refusing to ever be small again.